Okay, let's unpack this. In a world where headlines shift, I mean, practically by the hour, really getting what's happening beneath the surface, well, it's more crucial than ever.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the noise.
Exactly. So welcome everyone to the Deep Dive. This is your shortcut to getting well-informed. We take complex sources, dig through them, and pull out those vital nuggets of knowledge, those insights you need. I'm Jonky.
And I'm Pinay. It's good to be here.
Great to have you. Today, we're diving into a pretty detailed and I have to say, quite thought-provoking perspective on the current conflict in the Middle East. And specifically, we're looking at the United States' potential involvement, or maybe anticipated involvement is a better word.
Right, based on this specific source material?
Yeah, our focus is on an expert's insights. We're basically going to explore what this expert thinks is really unfolding and the reasons they give for it. It's quite an unsettling prediction, actually.
It certainly paints a stark picture.
So let's start with the core claim from the source. This war in the Middle East, it's only just begun. It's not expected to wrap up anytime soon.
Yeah, the expert really emphasizes that point, suggesting people grossly overestimated the impact of that initial surprise attack on Iran.
Overestimated how? What's the angle there?
Well, the source brings up this idea of potential U.S. complicity. The argument put forward is that President Trump's initial, maybe softer actions created a kind of illusion that a deal might be reached.
An illusion.
Yeah. And the source suggests this might have, quote, disarmed the Iranians initially, like maybe lowered their guard or readiness because they thought a negotiation was actually possible.
Okay. But then, according to this expert, Iran bounced back surprisingly fast.
Exactly. The source highlights the rapidity of their response, how quickly they deployed their arsenal. And this wasn't minor stuff.
Right. You mentioned the numbers.
Yeah. The specific detail given is that Iran has over 3,000 ballistic missiles. Think about that number.
Over 3,000.
With a serious range to 1,200 to 2,400 kilometers. And the really critical part, the source says only a fraction have been used thus far.
Wow. Okay, so that suggests a huge reserve of capabilities still untapped.
Precisely. Which ties into the next point. The source asserts Israel is now in for a long war, whether it wants it or not.
A long war for Israel.
And then the really big claim, the U.S. is about to join it. Not maybe, not possibly, but about to join.
About to join. That's a very strong statement. So President Trump announced he'd take 2 weeks to think about intervening. How does the source reconcile that with about to join?
Yeah, the source flat out calls that 2-week announcement nonsense.
Nonsense.
Just required preparation is how they put it. Basically, time needed to get the forces assembled. The expert is emphatic. The decision has been made.
And they claim inside sources for that.
Citing sources on the inside, yes. So the public statement is seen as just, a procedural step before the military action kicks off.
Okay, so the delay isn't indecision. It's logistics.
That's the argument. And the logistical challenges are massive. You have to reassemble these enormous numbers of naval and air assets that had been pulled out of the region previously.
Right.
You've got to replenish ships, food, water, munitions, and missiles. You need to bring in carrier battle groups, multiple groups probably.
Huge naval presence.
And then move huge numbers of aircraft supported by, get this, 30 to 40 air refueling assets. Those tankers are crucial for long-range air operations. It's a monumental task.
It really puts the 2-week time frame into a different perspective if that's the case. It's not thinking time, it's moving time.
That's exactly the interpretation offered by the source.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to Israel's situation, according to this source. The description used is pretty stark. On the ropes.
Yeah, on the ropes, suggesting they're really struggling, facing severe difficulties. The source also mentions a substantial portion of their country destroyed.
And they're asking for help. Urgently.
Very urgently. The source details pleas from Netanyahu directly to Trump for quick intervention. The reason given, Israel is apparently running out of interceptor missiles.
Running out. What about the Iron Dome? We hear so much about that.
Well, according to this expert, the Iron Dome is now appearing less powerful or convincing. Maybe overwhelmed, maybe the nature of the attacks change. It's not entirely clear from the summary, but the effectiveness is questioned.
Okay.
And to back this up, the source points to many, many large aircraft Globemasters. Those are the huge C-17 military transport planes landing in Israel.
Delivering what?
Delivering interceptors, Patriot missile systems, other crucial missile types. And here's another significant detail. The source claims U.S. troops are actually on the ground already.
Boots on the ground. Doing what?
Helping to man the radars and the SEAD batteries. The ADI is that Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System for shooting down ballistic missiles.
But not just sending equipment, but personnel to operate some of it.
That's the claim, which signifies a deeper level of involvement already happening, perhaps quietly.
Okay. Now, the source also challenges sort of common views of Iran itself, right? Paints a different picture.
Very different. Forget the stereotypes. The source describes Iran as a large continental power, emphasizes it's almost the size of Western Europe.
Western Europe, that's substantial.
Yeah, the comparison given is France, Germany, parts of Spain, northern Italy, all combined. That gives you a sense of the scale, the landmass, the population depth.
And how does that contrast with the U.S. approach?
Well, the source contrasts it with the U.S. primarily being an air and maritime power, suggesting the U.S. isn't really structured or prepared to commit the kind of large ground forces that might be needed for a protracted conflict on that scale.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And technologically, the source pushes back on the backward image.
Strongly. Argues Iran is far more technologically advanced and generally more capable than it was 20 years ago. So that old image, it's outdated and misleading, according to this view.
And Iran isn't alone in this. The source mentions international support.
Right. This is key. It's not just Iran versus potentially Israel and the U.S. The source says China, Russia, Pakistan, and other countries have poured assets into Iran to help the Iranians defend themselves.
Poured assets in. What kind of assets? Military, economic.
The source implies military and technological assistance, essentially bolstering Iran's defensive capabilities significantly. The takeaway quote is, "This is no cakewalk."
No cakewalk. Okay, this leads us to probably the most provocative part of the analysis, the goal of this war. What does the source claim is the ultimate objective?
Yeah, this is where it gets really controversial. The source states, quite bluntly, that this is a war for the Jewish state's hegemony across the entire region.
Hegemony, meaning regional dominance.
Dominance control. And aims specifically, the source claims, at the conquest and securing of the oil and gas fields. That shifts the motivation dramatically away from just defense or retaliation.
And the source connects this goal to other conflicts. You mentioned Russia earlier.
Exactly. It draws a direct line. It argues the same people with the same backers, naming financial oligarchs, institutions, political advocates who pushed for the war against Russia.
Which the source calls a failed war.
A failed war, yes, aimed at fragmenting Russia and grabbing its resources. That these same groups are now pushing for war against Iran, but this time explicitly on behalf of Israel's interests.
So a pattern of strategic interest driven by the same influential players.
That's the argument being presented, a continuation of a larger geopolitical play.
Wow. And the source gets even more specific about influence within the U.S., particularly regarding Netanyahu.
Extremely specific and very contentious. The claim is that Netanyahu has infinitely more control and influence over the U.S. Congress than President Trump does.
Infinitely more. That's quite a statement, making Trump.
Effectively his instrument, that's the direct quote. The source even alleges Trump uses gangster terms in conversations about this, believing he and others stand to profit personally from Iran's destruction.
Profit, personally. Yeah. Okay. This is quite an indictment. So given this alleged motivation, what's the proposed attack strategy against Iran itself?
According to the source, the primary goal is the destruction of the regime. Not just weakening it, but destroying it. Targeting apparently everything down to police stations in Tehran, trying to induce total paralysis.
Total paralysis. And secondary goals, uranium facilities.
Secondarily, yes, damaging those uranium enrichment facilities. But this is where a really alarming detail comes up.
Alarming how?
The source mentions active discussion about using MRR, minimal residual radiation weapons, or actual low-yield nuclear warheads.
Nuclear weapons to hit those facilities.
Specifically designed, apparently, to penetrate hardened bunkers or facilities where enrichment might occur. The source is unequivocal. This is a very bad idea.
I would imagine so. Opening Pandora's box.
Exactly. That's the phrase used. It warns this would unleash totally unpredictable, incredibly dangerous global consequences, a line that shouldn't be crossed.
This raises the question of past interventions. The source compares this to Iraq in 2003, but says it's different.
Yes, very explicitly states, Iraq and Iran are different. The key distinctions highlighted are First, U.S. capabilities back then.
How so?
In 2003, the U.S. had massive ground forces readily available and deployed, and its technical and military capabilities were overwhelming relative to Iraq at that time. The situation with Iran is presented as vastly different in terms of relative power and the type of conflict.
Okay, different capabilities. What else?
The source also points to the strategic blunder, the stupid mistake, as they call it, of occupying Iraq and completely dismantling its government afterwards.
And they attribute that mistake to specific people.
Yeah, names Paul Wolowitz and that little coterie of people referring to Paul Wolfowitz and the neoconservative figures influential in the Bush administration.
Right, the road to Jerusalem runs through Baghdad idea.
Precisely that belief. And the really concerning part, from the source's perspective, is the claim that the same kinds of people are driving the push for war with Iran now.
Implying a risk of repeating similar strategic miscalculations.
That's the clear implication. A pattern of thinking potentially leading down a similar or perhaps worse path.
And what about the wider world? What geopolitical consequences does the source foresee if the U.S. does join this conflict?
The outlook presented is grim for U.S. standing. The claim is the entire global South is coming on side with Iran. Not just traditional rivals, but potentially European states, India, China, the BRICS nations.
So a massive shift in global alignment.
A profound shift. The expert warns the outcome for the U.S. will be to become a pariah state all over the world, isolation on a global scale.
Becoming a pariah state,
Yeah.
that's a severe warning. Given all this, the potential downsides, the risks, is there any chance Trump might reconsider? Pull back?
The source seems quite pessimistic about that. The belief expressed is the decision has been made, and pulling back now would be very, very difficult.
Why so difficult? What's driving Trump, according to this view?
He's described as impulse and emotionally driven, and crucially, still influenced by a kind of 1991 mindset of the era of unchallenged U.S. power, the belief that the U.S. can just dictate outcomes.
A potentially outdated view of global power dynamics.
That's the suggestion, and this ties into a rather cynical take on the American public's attention span.
How so?
The source argues the American people aren't paying that much attention to this brewing conflict. They're more worried about everyday life, whether or not he can get a six-pack of beer tonight and watch the game on TV.
Ouch. So war is seen as remote, abstract.
Something that happens on someone else's soil, that's the quote. A fundamental disconnect from the reality and costs, at least for now.
But the source does mention things that could bring it home, right? Domestic issues.
Yes, it flags potential internal vulnerabilities that could shift public focus dramatically. Things like the estimated 30 million people admitted into the country about whom we know absolutely nothing.
Security concerns.
Security concerns, border issues, drug cartels using illegal ports of entry. These are presented as simmering domestic problems that might eventually override concern about foreign wars or perhaps expose vulnerabilities related to them.
So the focus might shift inward eventually. The source also criticizes prioritizing optics over reality in military terms.
Absolutely. Argues that these big, magnificent displays, sending carrier groups, flyovers, etc., they look impressive, but have minimal, if any, ultimate impact on the actual outcome of a long, grinding conflict like the one envisioned with Iran.
It's theater, not substance, in that view.
Pretty much, it raises the really critical question, what happens when the optics turn bad? Meaning, when we do start to take losses, what happens if the U.S. were to lose any capital ships, major warships, or when bases that we occupy in the region are blown up?
That's when the reality bites.
That's when the source suggests the American public will suddenly pay very close attention when the cost becomes undeniable and visible at home.
And linking back to the political influence argument, the source ends that section with a really blunt statement about Congress.
Incredibly blunt, just states, Mr. Netanyahu owns Congress, full stop.
Implying no real debate or oversight is happening.
Implying no debate, and that members of Congress are just lining up to have their pockets filled with cash. It suggests financial motive is overriding any genuine strategic deliberation or concern for consequences.
That's a deeply cynical view of the political process driving this.
Extremely cynical, yes.
Okay, which brings us back to possibly the most frightening aspect mentioned, the nuclear one. Is there, according to the source, a real possibility that in desperation the Israelis will use tactical nukes?
The source definitely treats it as a real possibility being discussed. It explicitly mentions those minimal residual radiation, MR weapons again, or the low-yield nuclear warheads designed for penetrating hardened sites.
And the source's assessment of using those.
A clear, strong warning. It would be a very serious mistake. It represents a level of escalation that we should not move to under any circumstances. It's presented as a red line with catastrophic potential.
A fundamental game changer for the worse.
Absolutely. The source ties this potential desperation or perhaps willingness to escalate to a combination of arrogance and self-delusion.
Arrogance and self-delusion.
Which the source concludes grimly, inevitably results in failure.
Okay, let's try to summarize the main takeaways from this source material we've explored. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
First, the war in the Middle East. According to this expert, it's just getting started, likely to be long. Second, the U.S. is poised to enter. A decision is allegedly made. Preparations underway.
Right. Third, Iran is presented not as a weak state, but as a formidable, large, technologically capable power with significant international backing, especially from Russia and China.
Definitely not a cakewalk.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth, the stated motivations are deeply unsettling regional hegemony, control of oil and gas, driven by influential groups with a history in prior conflicts.
And connected to that, the claim of profound external influence over U.S. policymaking, particularly Congress.
Yeah. And the strategy involves potentially devastating attacks, even discussions of using low-yield nuclear devices, which is horrifying.
And finally, the source is deeply skeptical this whole strategy can succeed. It warns of severe consequences, the U.S. becoming isolated globally, a pariah state.
Plus, potential domestic blowback once the American public grasps the true cost of the war. The expert really hammers home that idea of arrogance and self-delusion leading to failure.
That's the core warning threaded throughout the analysis.
So it leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty heavy thought. Given these stark warnings from the source about Iran's real capabilities, the shifting global picture, the alleged motivations, what does winning even look like in a conflict like this?
Right. What would constitute success under these conditions?
And, maybe more importantly, what unforeseen consequences, what other Pandora's boxes might be opened if these warnings about the strategy, about public awareness, if they are indeed ignored? Something to definitely think about.
A lot to think about.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
I'm Chunky.
And I'm Panai.